Meine Damen und Herren, ganz herzlich willkommen heute Abend hier, eigentlich im Liebieghaus. Das hier nennt sich Städel, aber unsere Veranstaltung findet im Liebieghaus statt. Die Presse heute war großartig, die Reaktionen, das Echo, erstklassig. Ganz besonders gut hat mir persönlich der Begriff gefallen, grandiose Überforderung. Ich denke, dass wir in einem gewissen Sinne anschließen werden, auch heute Abend. Ich denke, dass die Ausstellung, da sie ja so lange läuft, über 5 Monate, ausreichend Gelegenheit bieten wird, sich dieser Überforderung zu stellen, bis sie vielleicht langsam weicht einem vollständigen Durchdringen. Es ist für uns eine ganz besondere Ehre, William Kentridge heute Abend hier zu Gast zu haben. Er ist seit einigen Tagen schon in der Stadt, hat uns in der letzten Phase des Aufbaus geholfen. Wir haben zusammen diese Ausstellung bis ins Detail geplant. Das war bei Treffen in Johannesburg, das war bei Treffen in Salzburg oder Berlin oder auch in Rom oder hier im Liebieghaus. William Kentridge ist ein Ausnahmekünstler. Er versteht es, die Synästhesie als Ganzes und sehr komplex zu bespielen. Er ist ein Meister der Vernetzung der Medien und spricht die Sinne vollständig an. Viele von Ihnen werden schon in der Ausstellung gewesen sein. Die noch nicht da waren, sollten sich wirklich auf ein großartiges Ereignis freuen. Und in dem Kontext soll ich auch noch mal schnell darauf verweisen, dass Sie ja mit der Karte, mit dem Ticket von heute Abend auch noch schnell rübergehen können. Das Liebieghaus hat ja bis 21 Uhr offen und sich schon einmal der grandiosen Überforderung aussetzen können. William Kentridges Ursprung in der Auseinandersetzung, der formalen Auseinandersetzung, sein Ausgangspunkt ist immer die Zeichnung. Sein Lieblingsmaterial ist die Kohle oder auch die Tusche oder auch, das haben wir selbst mit ihm zusammen erleben dürfen, in Südafrika, der sehr schnelle, präzise Umgang mit dem Papier, das er zerreißt und in neue Formen, in neue Konstellationen überführt. Das ist schon ein kinetischer Vorgang, das ist schon ein Vorgang der Bewegung. Von dort aus wird das Werk weiterentwickelt bis hin in die große Perfektion der filmischen Umsetzung. William Kentridge ist ein Archäologe, er ist ein Archivar, er ist ein Historiker, greift tief zurück in die Geschichte, vor allem in die Geschichte des Bürgertums der westlichen Welt, greift das Bürgertum an, lehnt sich auch sehr mit einer großen Zuneigung andererseits an das, was da gewesen ist. Er ist in Südafrika, das wissen Sie, aufgewachsen. Er hat auch wegen der Tätigkeit seiner Eltern, sie haben sich außerordentlich eingesetzt für die Opfer der Apartheid-Politik. Als solcher ist er sehr früh schon als Kind auf die Opfer einer politischen Katastrophe gestoßen, im Bild, in der Fotografie. Ich denke, dass die Verarbeitung dieser Eindrücke weiterhin auch seine Arbeit prägen. Gestern, als wir eröffnet haben, das war ein Zufall, ein Nationalfeiertag in Südafrika, das haben wir nicht bewusst so gelegt, das ist der 21. März 1960, das Massaker von Sharpeville, ein ganz scharfes, furchtbares Ereignis mit vielen Todesopfern, das jetzt dazu geführt hat, dass dieser Tag in Südafrika selbst ein Nationalfeiertag ist, an dieses Massaker gedenkt, aber andererseits auch ein Feiertag ganz allgemein für die Menschenrechte ist. Und die Menschenrechte, das ist das tiefere Thema in Kentridges Arbeit. Wir werden heute, ich bin selbst außerordentlich gespannt, über sein neues Projekt erfahren, The Head and the Load. Dieses Projekt, diese Performance wird er im Juli uraufführen in der Turbinenhalle der Tate Modern. Dann wird eine Welttournee dieses großartigen und wohl sehr groß angelegten Werkes folgen, unter anderem auch die Ruhr-Triennale in Deutschland berühren. William, thank you so much. This stage is yours.
I thought I would use the occasion this evening to think aloud about a project that I'm working on the moment. It's a project that has to have its first iteration in July, and then has further iterations in August at the Ruhr Triennale and later on in other cities. But it's a project under construction at the moment, and it will be useful for me to try to tease out some of the ideas around it during the talk this evening. But I thought I would begin just by giving you a flavor of the first workshop. Every time a large project is done, I gather all the different people involved, musicians, dancers, actors, filmmakers, a whole group of performers and makers to think about the project in the process of making it. And I suppose if there's one theme that will come out this evening, it has to do with trying to think in a material. So the form of the lecture this evening is one kind of thinking, in which one is using the spoken voice, the words, the gaps between the words, the pauses, the repeats, the reiterations, not just the words themselves, but the whole rhetoric of talking as one form of thinking. But I want to talk and show different ways of thinking in a material. But to begin with, just to give you a sense of what the workshop is like, here's a short extract of some of the days of work in the workshop in my studio in Johannesburg. Maybe we can lower the lights in the room. That's fine. that gives a taste of the kind of chaos and madness of the days of making a piece, trying to discover what is the vocabulary, what are the raw materials, what are the elements that would go into it. This was done about 4 months ago, so we're now 4 months clearer than that as to which elements we keep and which ones we abandoned and how the piece starts to get structured. But I'll start away from the project with the question of what are we to do with history? And it's a rhetorical, but it's also an immediate question. The project that I'm working on, The Head and the Load, is a project about Africa and the First World War. So on the one hand, it's about a history that's over a century old. But while working on the project, it became clear that it's also very much about contemporary history. And the weight of old history is still a very contemporary political question. In South Africa over the last 2 years, the universities have been virtually closed down by student protests that have to do with the presence of statues of colonial leaders that are in the university campuses. Very often people like Cecil John Rhodes gave the money for the university, so the university put up a statue to him. There's another university called Rhodes University. And the students at the time now felt it was insane in 2018, when we've had 25 years after the end of apartheid and liberation, still to have as the main statues on the campus, statues making heroes of people who had been colonial monsters in very many ways. In the United States of America, there are questions of what to do with statues of Confederate heroes, people who are heroes to the white voters in the southern states of the United States, but which are seen as insulting and hurtful to black people whose ancestors were slaves, and to feel that this is still a celebration of slave mastery. In Australia at the moment, there's a whole series of debates going on about Australian place names. A lot of the cities are named after colonial heroes who were responsible for the genocide of Aboriginal people in Australia. So these are not, they're historical, they're questions which have a historical origin, but they're very much the questions of the politics of today. How do we make sense of the past? We understand that to simply take all the statues down and pretend that that history didn't exist is an unacceptable solution. But to continue as if nothing have changed is an equally unacceptable solution. So there is no good solution. One has to find the least bad solution. And one of the things that art is very good at is in finding the less good idea, in finding the less bad solution, in failing, but failing better each time. And that, in a way, is one of the thrusts behind the question of the Africa in the First World War. The whole question of what is the nature of colonialism. And to give a background, I'm sure many of you, as I did, thought when we think of the First World War, we can think of two primary texts. In the German-speaking world, All Quiet on the Western Front, which as a teenager was the book that kind of revealed the First World War to me. And then in the English-speaking world, the poems of the great First World War poets, Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon. And what they do is they give us a view of the First World War as an entirely European conflict, which is what I had assumed it was until I started reading and being told about that. No, there were all these people from other parts of the world that were involved in the conflict. I mean, there were 300,000 Chinese people in the trenches. There were hundreds of thousands from Barbados. There were many, many hundreds of thousands of Indian soldiers in the First World War. And there's a way in which one can think about the First World War as a continuation of the Conference of Berlin. Just to remind you that in 1884 and 1885 in Berlin, the continent of Africa was formally divided by the European powers. Germany was very late in getting African colonies, and the conference was organized to give Germany some colonies also. So the main people were France, Britain, Portugal, Belgium had the whole of the Congo, and Germany then was ratified in having Deutsch Südwestafrika, Togo, Cameroon, and German East Africa. And at the end of the First World War, Germany lost all its colonies. They became British or French or divided between the British and the French or given to South Africa. So there's a way in which you can think of this huge conflagration in Europe as being about the continuation and final division of the African continent by European partners. And the questions which arise today in Africa about the nature of decolonization, what is the relationship of Africa to Europe still today, is a question that is both a moral and an ethical and even a legal question. There are still court cases in Germany today from the descendants of the Herero who were killed by German troops in the first genocide of the 20th century, the Herero genocide of 1904. So these are current questions. But I started on the project out of a sense of anger at myself for my own lack of knowledge, the fact that I had no knowledge of this at all. It had never been taught at school. I had assumed that the First World War was entirely a European question, but some basic facts. The first shots fired in the First World War, the first aggressive shots were fired in Togo in Africa. And the war in Africa went on till 2 weeks after the armistice, because that's how long it took the news to get to the troops fighting in German East Africa. The number of troops was relatively small, but the number of Africans involved was enormous. Over a million Africans were involved in the war, either as soldiers or as laborers. And there were in the end over 1 million African casualties of the First World War. Maybe 20,000 soldiers, about 300,000 laborers, and 700,000 civilians. So in terms of the impact on Africa, it's still been an enormous question. And my ignorance of all of these things, as I'm sure for many of you this is a surprise to hear, is what prompted the starting of the project. Now, the project itself always has to have a balance of two things. It has to have a theme that intrigues me or interests me. In this case, the starting point was a kind of frustration at my own ignorance. And the project is also done to answer that ignorance in myself. But it also has to have a material in which one can think. And sometimes that material, as in the animated films, is charcoal and erasure, in which case the erasure and charcoal brings ideas and themes of memory, of time passing forward. Sometimes the material could be ink on paper and the tearing up of that as about fragmentation. And in this piece, the material has to do with different kinds of performance. The performance of procession, the performance of languages that aren't understood. If one thinks of the great artworks of the First World War, the central artwork of the First World War was without doubt the development of Dada in 1916 in the middle of the war. And Dada started as an idea of the impossibility of the logic of what had gone before. And that instead of trying to make sense of contemporary logics, one needed to find a language and a way of thinking that was impossible to understand, that had illogic and incomprehensibility at its heart. So you have the great sound poems of the time. You have poems which develop later but come out of Dada, like the Sonata of Kurt Schwitters, with the words that don't make sense. I mean, fums povota ca u pogif qui e, raketarinsketa, 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 tedes ie pf tilf tu, fums povo, povoro, fums povoro, povorota, fums povorota, povorotaca, fums povorotaca, povorotaca u, fums povorotaca u, povorotaca u pog, fums povorotaca u po, povorotaca u pogif, fums povorotaca u pogif qui e, and so on. It goes on like, it goes on. So it's about the kind of sound of language that one is trying to understand. So an important part of this became the idea of thinking we've got Europe on the one hand, which is to say the high modernism of Hindemith, of Ravel, of Satie, of Schoenberg, of music being written then. We've got from Africa an African choral tradition that is coming through it. And coming down the middle, 1916, we have Dada, and its different expressions. So that gave a kind of a latitude, a width, Europe on one side, Africa on the other, and Dada and the abandonment of logic, or the shattering of logic as a third line. And it became clear when one reads the historical records of what people were saying and thinking, and I'll come onto this further, that there was an incomprehension. Europe could not understand Africa. Africa fundamentally misunderstood Europe. And a language or a performance which doesn't kind of deal with that intractable question feels it's missing or going around it. So very early on, we started playing with a number of different languages and translating things from one language to another, translating the great Wilfred Owen poem, what passing bells for these who die as cattle, only the monstrous stuttering rifles rapid rattle. We translated into dogs barking, a different kind of Dada. The Tristan Zara's Dada Manifesto, in fact, is performed largely in Zulu. Frantz Fanon comes out of French into Seswati. Marinetti stays in Italian. And there's a kind of a series of manifestos which are half understood. We help with some text projected on the screen for an audience, but it has to do with trying to make sense of what it is when the world comes together from all the different corners and doesn't make sense. There's a contemporary argument amongst European histories who try to proclaim that the trenches of the First World War were the first cosmopolitan city, because there were Indians and Chinese and people from Senegal, as well as French and Italian, all in these trenches, and that became for them But in fact, I think the truth is rather it became a demonstration of incomprehension rather than comprehension, and that structures of power and dependency are so rife in there. But anyway, it gave language as one of the key materials with which we play. That's not in the first section that you've seen. That's what we're busy with at the moment, and that we have to get right for July when we perform it. But when I talk about language not being understood, I'll read you an extract from a letter. This is a letter written by a Baptist preacher, an African man called John Chilembwe, who'd been at a mission school, an Scottish mission school. He'd gone to a seminary in the United States to finish his theological studies. And he'd come back and opened a church in what was then Nyasaland, what is now Malawi. That's about 2 little countries north of South Africa, in the center of Africa. And at the time of the war, at the time of the outbreak of war, Chilembwe wrote a letter to the Nyasaland Times, to the newspaper. And these are extracts of it. It's a longer letter, but I shorten it. The letter that he sent, he titled, "The Voice of the African Native in the Present Conflict." This was in 1915. And he writes, "We understand we have been invited to shed our blood in this world's war. We ask the honorable government of our country, which is known as Nyasaland, will there be any good prospects for the natives at the end of this war? Shall we be recognized as anyone in the best interests of civilization and Christianity after the great struggle is ended? For our part, we have unreservedly stepped into the firing line of every conflict and played a patriot's part with the spirit of true gallantry, while honor and credit have gone to others. In times of peace, everything for Europeans only, and instead of honor, we suffer humiliation with names contemptible. But in time of war, it is found that we are needed to share the hardships and shed our blood in equality. If this is a war for honor, for government, gain of riches and so on, let the rich man, the bankers, the titlemen, the shopkeepers go to war and get shot. But instead, the poor Africans who have nothing to own in this world and who in death leave only a long line of widows and orphans and utter want and dire distress, are invited to die for a cause which is not theirs. Then he ends off saying, "We leave all for the consideration of the government. We hope in the mercy of Almighty God that someday things will turn out well and the government will recognize our indispensability and that justice will prevail." So to our ears, a very clear and easily comprehensible letter. In the context of the time, an impossible letter. The letter was suspended. Chilembwe, in desperation, started a revolt. The revolt was put down. Chilembwe was killed. The church was blown up. And this became the pattern. So on the one hand, you have Chilembwe writing this letter saying, why should we be part of this war that is not ours? On the other hand, you have other African leaders saying, we demand the right to go and fight and die for France, so that once the battle is over, French people can see that we need equal rights or civic rights. So this paradox, the central paradox, what is the relationship to Europe? Is it something we want to become part of? And the people who say we want to be part of this war? Is it something we want to distance ourselves from, as in Chilembwe's letter? It makes for a kind of paroxysm of history, of not knowing which way to go, of all the contradictions being squeezed into that moment. And I suppose it's that compression of contemporary questions into this moment of history that becomes, in a way, the heart of the piece. But then what do I mean about thinking in material? What does it mean to think in material? Well, I'll show you some of the extracts of bits of projection and bits of action and try to talk about those to show the direction of thinking. Now, just to pause for a moment, the projection happens, or the performance happens on a very wide stage, 50 meters. So this is most probably 20 meters, this room. So it's maybe 2.5 times the length of the room is the stage, which enables us to do a procession from one side to the other, to have people calling from one side to another, almost as if there are continents on each end of the stage. And this would be a projection across that distance of a kind of fairground carousel of targets to shoot at. And the question is, within these moments that flow like this, which we can prolong and continue, there's a performance in the front, perhaps some of the text even that I was reading to you of John Chilembwe, and then moments when an image holds itself, which range from colonial images to European images, with the sounds of gunshots being made, and made by an orchestra, not recorded, the live orchestra on stage doing the different shell drops. The particular sound that we're trying to recreate is the sound of a gas shell being fired, which has a very particular strange fairground sound of an explosion and a whee as it goes out. I mean, there are interesting historical archives that we're finding of this. One of them, in fact, is the most interesting archive is in Berlin. At the turn of the last century, as is familiar to, I'm sure, all of you, there was this great interest in a kind of human anatomy, the study of human anatomy, of measuring skulls, of checking people out, of seeing what is an Aryan skull, what is a Negro skull, what is a Jewish skull, what is a criminal skull, all of these kinds of things. And together with that was trying to catalog in a very scientific way all the different languages and attributes of people in different parts of the world. And so around 1900, there were great expeditions of German ethnographers that traveled around the continent of Africa, making very basic recordings on wax cylinders to try to catalog all of these elements. I mean, there's always been a strange, I'm sure, a strange mixture of the scientific and the authoritarian and the violent that go together. So one of the results of the 1904 genocide was that there was a great collection of skulls of people who'd been killed that were boiled and cleaned and sent from Southwest Africa to Berlin to this anatomy institute, where they stayed until very, very recently. But the collection of this information was hastened during the First World War and made easier by the fact that there were so many Africans from different parts of Africa around the trenches, some as soldiers, mainly as laborers, but that many were captured as prisoners of war. And there were large camps of prisoners of war outside Berlin. And in fact, there was a special request that all the African prisoners of war should go to the camp outside of Berlin so that the ethnographers there could make recordings of their voices. And in Humboldt University in Berlin, they still have all the wax cylinders of all the voices of all these people of many different tribes, different groups of Africans and different language groups. And it's usually people counting. You hear counting being done. Sometimes it's songs, sometimes it's other lists of words. But the extraordinary thing is that you're hearing these voices from 1915 or 1916. And the very fact that they're so fuzzy and so much crackle on the wax cylinder makes you understand these are real people speaking at that time. It's a strange time machine, these wax cylinders. So that's part of the researches in Germany, part of it was in Senegal, part of it was in the Imperial War Museum in Britain, not to try to make a historically accurate production or a didactic production that will teach the history as I'm teaching now, as I'm describing it now, but to find the raw material, to find the vocabulary, to find the kind of movements, the kind of sound with which to work. We'll go on, keep watching another section as it goes. So some of these elements will be used, and some of them are testing things out. This one will most probably be used because it will work with people in front and their shadows cast on the screen. One of the other starting points for the project was a project I did in Rome, which involved a long procession along the banks of the Tiber River. And for this project, we worked with large-scale shadows, people walking in front of lights, casting large shadows on the walls of the banks of the Tiber River. And so the casting of shadows becomes, as you saw in the initial workshop trip, part of the language that we're working with a change of scale, moving closer to a light, further from a light. This section has to do with a question of how does one represent violence? How does one show the violence of a war? And I was told of a story, the image of these birds, and mainly pigeons, comes from that around this time there was a man whose passion was pigeons, keeping pigeons. And he kept, his pigeons were his main life and interest. And he had a daughter, and his daughter died of tuberculosis. And somebody told him that his daughter had been infected with tuberculosis from his birds. So he went out and killed each of his birds one by one as a kind of act of grief and rage. So the bird suddenly, from that story that has nothing to do with the First World War, came in as an image to start playing with. And of course, birds in the First World War were kind of a primitive drone that we have now. They were both used for sending messages. There were also birds that had cameras strapped on their chest to fly over enemy lines to try to take photographs of what was happening. But these were... So this is partly an experiment to see, do we like it with the with this Satie? So this is a song of Satie from that period. Do we want Je te veux? Do we want that, or do we prefer the much more violent music that was at the beginning? So these are the kind of practical, and it's a thinking in material because it's not as if there's a theoretical answer that's given in advance. It takes the act of watching and listening and seeing what it evokes to start to make the decisions as to how the piece should be structured. At the moment, we're kind of hedging our bets. We've got part of it with the Je te veux and part of it with one of the other songs of the piece of music you heard. And in the next workshop, we'll have to start either finding a transition or making a choice, or finding we don't need it at all and the whole piece gets thrown out. So there's also in this question of how does one deal and try to show, how does one deal with violence and the enigmas of what was happening in the war. When one hears stories of great tenderness from one person to another, when someone's in extremis, when they're dying, when they're shot, when they're wounded, to the kind of complete disregarding of other people's humanity in the act of fighting. And so we've worked with some wonderful dancers, South African dancers, playing with different ways of seeing what the body does at different times. And these are some fragments of the dance. There's one piece which I don't have here, which we saw a little bit in the first I'll try to find it, in the first clip of the workshop. Okay, so this was a question which has to do with a kind of paroxysm of history. It has to do with the being caught in the letter of Chilembwe and in the other people saying, I want to be part of this Europe, part of these European questions, I'll answer the bugle call, and another part of your body absolutely resisting and say, that should have nothing to do with me, I want to avoid that. And Gregory Makoma, one of the great South African dancers, this was in the workshop, is starting what came out of what he was doing. I said, I just want you to be marching and saluting, and let's see what happens if that gets pushed. And this gives a tiny bit of the fragment, but it had to do with being caught in the salute or not in a salute, as being caught in that paroxysm. Try and see if in the body itself we can show that paradox and contradiction of that colonial condition. But these other dances are different things that have, this is a kind of a dance that has to do with a wounded man, and you're not sure if he's being strangled or held up or a puppet or quite what it is there. So in this piece, there's something wonderful about the man with his knees half bent and the slow movements in front of his face, which was really an accompaniment to the dance happening at the side. But I suspect the dance at the side gets much too balletic and much too like dance, and that won't use. But Nhlanhla, who's standing there, becomes the key moment. So very often things which are at the periphery, at the edge of what we're focusing on, suddenly come into the center and take their place in the center. And that's another thing of what I would mean by allowing the material to think for us. What is it that we recognize in some detail that seems to get to the heart of the question more than the grand idea we'd had at the beginning of the work? So we have a long stage, 50 meters. We have actors and we have dancers and singers and musicians on stage, and we have the projections behind. And sometimes the projections are just landscapes of different kinds, different landscapes against which we can throw the shadows of the performers. Sometimes they're landscapes for text to appear. They shift between different kinds of African landscape, from the savannah to a kind of jungle, and from there to Flanders. So we can do that jump from Africa to Flanders just in the dissolve of a landscape. So if you take a single figure on the 50-meter stage and he's in Africa and suddenly he's alone in Flanders, it's a way of thinking about what that isolation is, of being taken from a place you know to a place that seems so utterly unfamiliar. This is from a section on the history of African revolts and what happens to that historical memory of those revolts, how it gets disappeared and swallowed by the landscape. And then we also have, as one of the languages we're working with, the influence of Dada films of the 1920s and 30s, where you have a series of modernist experiments with what film can make. And this is from a section of the list of the dead that slowly comes on, which we are working with. There's a sense that all the names of so many European soldiers who died in the war are known and recorded in all the war cemeteries around Flanders and in other places, and in railway stations in Britain. Everyone from that village who died is listed. And I'm sure there's similar memorials throughout Germany and France. Whereas they're very, very trying to find lists of names of the particular individuals who died in Africa is almost impossible. So it's a kind of honorary listing of possible names of people who might have died, a kind of a stating of absence in the writing of the names. So these are some fragments of the films. Each film is on a screen, or there are 3 screens which are about 10 meters high, each screen, and about 20 meters wide. So there are, although they look small here, they'll be very large. And again, it's trying to find what is the language of film. This is trying to find kind of different Morse codes. This is a German Morse code that in fact comes from the Radetzky March. But there's a lot of Karl Kraus, The Last Days of Mankind in it. There's Aimé Césaire. There's Tristan Tzara. There's history as collage, trying to say that a single grand narrative of history no longer works, and that one has to find a multiplicity of different voices to try to get some idea of the complexity of the contradictions that are so built into the idea of a historical narrative. That what the world is from different perspectives is so utterly different.
Nini ni sha, lako ni lako, vai vai vai, lako ni lako, weiße Peruken, nini sha, dust. Dai duru, nini ko, nengo chubus hasa, dust. Nini sha, lako ni lako, sisi pende, sisi taki, dust.
So that gives some idea of the different kinds of languages, and it's not so much to give a final idea of what the piece will be like, which I hope will not be quite like this. It will have a kind of a flow and make sense, but to state as a kind of polemic, I suppose, the idea that one needs to find a material to think in that is different simply from logical argument that I'm trying to make here. To try to see if there are other ways in which one can separate reason from rationality. To understand that the work that is done by musicians, by artists in different ways, writers in different ways, are not divorced from the world, even though they may look completely illogical, but trying to say, how do we try to give an equivalent of the way we construct meaning in the world? And to end off, what I'll show you is what I would call the necessary stupidity of the studio. So these are fragments that go from the stupid to the ridiculous, things that we're very unlikely to use in the end, in the final production, but in which there is an openness, and every utterance and every gesture is given the benefit of the doubt at the start, in case there is something that comes from these surprising impulses that gives a connection and an insight into the work that is being done. So I'll end with these tiny fragments from the workshop again.
Oggi 5 secondi, cannoni, sventrare, spazio, all'infinito, tam, tum, tum, ammutinamento.
Thank you. Thank you very much.